Today, let's talk about waiting, which is something we all have to do, but we all hate to do. But the question we want to ask today is, do you wait well or do you wait poorly? Join us today to see how King David did it. All right, good morning. Today, let's talk about this whole idea of waiting. Our choice is going to be to wait well when we're waiting or to wait poorly when we're waiting for things. But we do know this, that we hate, here you go, waiting. We just do. So I was thinking about this in regards to the whole COVID era, 2020, okay? When it first came on the scene and suddenly, the president, vice president came on and said 15 days to slow the spread, and waiting 15 days seemed like an eternity. And I was kind of grumpy about it because I was just like, I got things to do, okay? I can't just sit home for 15 days. But for us, you too, life basically just came to a halt. And I thought, all right, I'm going to try to wait well in 15 days, and that was tough. But then that 15 turned to 30, and that 30 turned to months and even years. I mean, I personally just wanted things to get back to normal. We couldn't even come back to Bible study, to the place where we have our Bible study for 18 months. And I looking back thinking I would have been happy with just the 15 days, but it just it wasn't like that. But when people wait, it's difficult enough, but it's hard to wait when you have bad news being thrown at you all the time. So I was thinking about this during COVID. When we were waiting, literally we would watch the news because we didn't know what was going on, and everything was negative. All we could see was this many people are dying and this many people are, suffering, and these people are losing their jobs and their businesses are blowing up. And you're just like, what? And it was a really, really tough time. But what I realized is that waiting for things is hard regardless of whether it's a pandemic like COVID or waiting maybe for that job that you've been waiting for. Or some people are waiting to get married. Some people are waiting to have a baby. Some people are waiting, for your spouse to get saved. Some people are waiting to feel better. I mean, waiting is just difficult. And so I started wondering, okay, if we say we're Christians, which I should have learned to wait well, but if we say we're Christians, we should be waiting differently than someone who isn't a Christian. Like, I kind of think that's true. Because whether we're waiting for COVID to go away or waiting to heal from a car accident or waiting for the divorce to be final or waiting to get a job, we as Christians face the same heartache and hurt in life, whether we're a follower of Jesus or not. Like, we're not immune to waiting and hardship just because we know Christ. So the question I have is there an advantage to being a Christian? Is there an advantage in waiting that differs from someone who isn't a Christian? So I kind of went down that path because during COVID, we saw both. We saw how Christians and non-Christians responded to this whole idea of waiting in hardship. And we were watching a lot of our Christian friends stress. They were worried. They were consumed by it because they were just waiting for things to get back to normal because, and I get this, they were worried their businesses would be shut down. They were waiting and worrying that, how am I going to pay my employees? They were waiting and worrying in case, like, well, what if I have to let people go? Like, that's going to hurt these families. A lot of people were waiting and worried because they couldn't pay their bills. But you know what else we saw? During the waiting, we saw non-Christians worried about the exact same things. They didn't know how to trust God, but here's what we realized. Christians were worried and stressed about the same things. So I wondered, is that how it should be? Like, should we as Christians wait different than those who are not Christians? And I would say, yeah, I think that we should wait differently because we should be the ones that are relaxed during the waiting because we trust God. We know He's always doing something. We should be the ones that have more peace and more joy in the midst of the waiting and the hardship. But is that what we look like when we have these waiting seasons in our life? So let's learn how to wait well from King David. When we first meet King David, he wasn't the king, he was a teenage boy. He was in the field shepherding some sheep. He probably never thought he would do anything but that. He came from a family of, shepherds and sheep and all that kind of stuff. He's the youngest of 8. And while he's out there with the sheep, the prophet Samuel shows up at his father's house. And God tells Samuel to go to David's house, with all the brothers, because one of those brothers would be the next king. So Samuel shows up, 7 of the brothers paraded in front of him, but there's no nudge from God that any one of them are supposed to be king. 1 Samuel 16:11 says this, then Samuel asked, are these all the sons you have? And Jesse's like, well, they're still the youngest, Jesse replied, but he's out in the field watching the sheep and the goats. Send for him at once, Samuel said. We will not sit down to eat until he arrives. So David shows up, verse 12. So Jesse sent for him. He was dark and handsome with beautiful eyes. And the Lord said, this is the one, anoint him. So as David stood there among his brothers, Samuel took the flask of oil he had brought and anointed David with the oil. And the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. Then Samuel returned to Ramah. Now, must have been a weird scene. He's the youngest of all of these boys. They have to be going, what? Little baby David is going to be the next king? But the problem with David is he's just a teenager. He knows there's already a king. Saul is the king. So in his mind, it's like, okay, that was weird. I'm going to be king, but what am I supposed to do? Like go knock on the palace door and be like, hey, Saul, I'm your next king. And he didn't do that. And I think that's why he actually picked David. Because David didn't run out and get business cards with his new title, King David, on it, as a teenager. He didn't go out and get a loan for a new chariot. He didn't call and text all of his friends with the good news. He didn't put it on Facebook. Now, of course, they didn't have that back then. And he didn't even seem to gloat over his brothers. You know what he did? He just went back to his sheep. And what did he do? He waited. And he waited not for a day or a week or a month or a year, but he would actually wait over 20 years to be king over a small portion of Israel, and then an additional 7 years to be king over all of Israel. But here is what he did through the waiting that we can learn. He just kept walking, okay? And while he walked, he believed God was doing something. He just kept up with his day-to-day stuff. So if we get 15 days to slow the spread, well, you just do the best you can during those 15 days. And then 30, and then 3 months, and then however long it takes. We're just trusting and believing that God is actually doing something. And I realize that there really should be a difference between how Christians handle waiting versus a non-Christian. Because for us, we believe God has a purpose in the waiting. Because here's what we learn. During the waiting period, we see David wasn't exempt from waiting because he was a follower of God. But what we see is that what God was doing in the waiting is this. God was growing David's faith. David had to continually believe that God was in this, whatever he was going through during the waiting. The other thing we learned was God was putting David in situations where he had no choice but to trust him to take care of him, to provide for him. David was put in positions where it's like, God, the king is trying to kill me. You're going to have to provide for me. You're going to have to protect me. And all of that happened during the waiting period. That's what God used to grow up David's faith. And then here was another one. God was showing David that what he was stressed and worried about might be what has been distracting him from a relationship with him. All the things that distract us, God's like, in the waiting, he's going to show us, you need to stop being distracted with your work or your whatever the things that are distracting you. And in the waiting, you need to focus on me now. Pick up your Bible, start reading, get to know me in this waiting time. And that's why we can wait well. Because we know God has a purpose in our waiting time. Now, for David, God's end game was that David was going to be king. But it would be David's responsibility to wait well until God's timing was right for David. But for a non-Christian, think about this, there is no purpose. What are they waiting for? There's no one behind the waiting period for them. They're just waiting to get back at their jobs, waiting to get, make money, go on with their lives. And they do so without allowing God to ever be a part of it or knowing that He can be a part of it. They do so without ever allowing God to give them the peace to wait well, without ever allowing God to show up for them like God shows up for us. I love Psalm 27:14. David says, "Wait on the Lord. Be of good courage, and He shall strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord." For David, that's what he learned. So when it comes to waiting, he did what we need to do, which is this. He kept doing what he normally did. He kept living like he normally lived. And he just waited until God made a move, until God changed his circumstances, until God opened a door, until God was ready to put all the pieces in place. And then when God was ready, when that door was open, David walked through it and he was ready. Because David spent the time during the waiting period to grow up in his faith, and that's what we need to do. Whatever you're going through, whatever you're waiting for, let's learn from David. As a follower of Jesus, let's not waste our waiting time. Let's wait different than those who do not know that God is in control and is always working behind the scenes. Let's wait differently than those people. I hope that helps you wait today. Have a good day.